The concrete froze before it could set properly. I need you to understand what that means. In February of 1927, with temperatures so far below zero that spit turned to ice before it hit the ground, we poured 300 tons of cement into that shaft, mixed it with boiling water, worked through the night by torchlight, 17 men hauling buckets down from the surface while the guards watched us with their rifles ready. The concrete should have sealed that hole forever, should have locked away whatever we'd found down there in the warm darkness, 300 meters beneath the Ural Mountains. But the cold got to it first. When we came back the next morning, we could hear the cracking. Hairline fractures spreading through the plug like a spider's web, and underneath that sound, something else, something moving in the spaces between. The guards ordered us to pour another layer, then another. By the time Moscow sent the dynamite charges, we'd used enough concrete to build a cathedral. It still wasn't enough, but I'm getting ahead of myself. You want to know how it started? You want to know why 37 political prisoners were digging a mine shaft in country so remote that the nearest settlement was 200 kilometers of frozen wasteland? You want to know what we found down there that made the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs send sealed orders to bury the whole thing? My name is Pavel Antonovich Krupin. I was 19 years old in the winter of 1927, sentenced to 15 years in the camps for the crime of owning 4 books the state considered dangerous: Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, a collection of folk tales, and 1 slim volume of poetry by a writer whose name I won't speak even now, 63 years later. 37 men went down into that shaft over the course of 3 weeks. 18 came back up. I was one of the 18, and some nights I wish I hadn't been. The camp had no name on any map. We called it Facility 7, though the guards just called it the Hole. 200 men crammed into barracks built for 50, working the timber stands and quarry sites that would help build Stalin's new Soviet paradise. The commandant was a man named Kozlov, thick through the shoulders with the kind of face that suggested he'd been settling disputes with his fists since childhood. His deputy, Lieutenant Markov, was younger but meaner, the sort who pulled wings off flies as a boy and graduated to larger cruelties as a man. The winter of 1927 was the coldest anyone could remember. The regular work sites froze solid. Quarrying became impossible. The timber crews couldn't make their quotas because the saws kept seizing up, the metal too brittle in the brutal cold. But the state needed resources, and failure wasn't acceptable. So Kozlov gathered us in the mess hall on a February morning when the thermometer read 43 below zero and told us we were going to dig. The geological surveys, he said, showed coal deposits in the mountains east of the camp. A new shaft would be sunk. Production would continue. The glory of the Soviet Union demanded it. What he didn't tell us was that the survey team had never come back from their expedition the previous autumn. The work detail was composed of the younger prisoners, those still strong enough to swing a pick after months of inadequate rations and backbreaking labor. I was chosen, along with my bunkmate Alexei Volkov, the former professor of geology who'd been imprisoned for teaching theories the state deemed counter-revolutionary. There was Boris Karpinsky, a steelworker from Leningrad with hands like iron and a laugh that could warm you even in that godforsaken cold. Viktor Semenov, who'd been a journalist before he wrote the wrong article about collective farming. Mikhail Petrov, barely 18, sentenced for distributing leaflets at Moscow University. Dmitri Volkov was our brigade leader, chosen because his geological background made him useful and because Kozlov thought an educated man would keep the rest of us in line. Dmitri was in his 40s, gray-bearded and serious, with the kind of quiet dignity that prison couldn't break. He'd been a professor at the Mining Institute before his arrest, and he understood rock and earth the way other men understood tools or animals. He took one look at the site they'd chosen for our shaft, and his face went pale. "This ground is wrong," he told Markov quietly. "The rock formations, the soil composition. There shouldn't be thermal activity here, but look." He pointed to patches where the snow had melted despite the killing cold. "Something's generating heat underneath. We should drill test bore holes, take proper measurements." Markov smiled the way he smiled before he ordered a beating. "You'll dig where you're told to dig, Professor, unless you prefer a transfer to the logging camps." We all knew what that meant. The logging camps were where men went to die quickly instead of slowly. So we dug. The first week wasn't unusual, considering the conditions. The top layer of soil was frozen hard as concrete, and every swing of the pick sent shockwaves up our arms that rattled our teeth. We worked in shifts of 6 men, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, with armed guards watching from the rim of the excavation. The shaft went down slowly, perhaps 3 meters in those first 7 days. But even then, there were signs that something wasn't right. The earth warmed as we dug deeper, not gradually the way you'd expect from geothermal activity, but in sudden pockets. We'd break through a layer of frozen soil and hit ground that was merely cold, then frozen again, then almost warm. The temperature changes made no geological sense, Dmitri told us quietly when the guards weren't listening. On the 3rd day, Alexei's pick brought up a chunk of rock that didn't belong. Dark stone, almost black, with a surface that felt slick to the touch even through our work gloves. It was heavier than it should have been for its size, and when you held it too long, it made your fingers tingle in an unpleasant way. Dmitri examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "This isn't local stone," he said. "The nearest deposits of this type of rock are hundreds of kilometers south. How did it get here?" We didn't have an answer for that, but as we dug deeper, we found more of it. The smell started on the 8th day. It wasn't the usual odors you'd expect from excavation work, not earth or stone or even the metallic tang of groundwater. This was organic, rich and thick and somehow warm, like the breath of something that had been sleeping in the dark for a very long time. It seemed to rise from the deeper parts of the shaft, growing stronger as we worked. Boris made a joke about it the first time we noticed it. "Smells like my grandmother's root cellar," he said, trying to keep things light. But his laugh was forced, and after that day he started breathing through his mouth when he worked. By the end of the 2nd week, the shaft was 12 meters deep, and the smell had become impossible to ignore. It coated the back of your throat and wouldn't leave, no matter how much of the thin camp soup you choked down at meals. Worse, it seemed to follow us back to the barracks. Men complained that their blankets reeked of it. Some of the other prisoners started avoiding our work detail, claiming we smelled like something that had been buried too long. The guards noticed it too. Lieutenant Markov took to standing upwind of the excavation site, and more than once I saw him cover his nose with his sleeve when the wind shifted. On the 14th day, young Mikhail Petrov was working the deepest part of the shaft when his pick struck something that rang like metal. Not the dull clang of hitting a rock or root, but a clear, bell-like tone that seemed to echo from somewhere much deeper than our excavation should have reached. Dmitri went down immediately to examine what Mikhail had found. We watched from above as he scraped away dirt and stone with his hands, uncovering what looked like a curved surface of that same dark rock we'd been finding. But this piece was different, worked somehow, shaped, as if it had been carved by tools rather than formed by natural processes. He spent an hour down there, clearing more of the surface, following its contours. When he finally came back up the ladder, his face was troubled. "How deep are we?" he asked. 14 meters, Victor answered. "Maybe 15. Dmitri shook his head slowly. "That's not possible. What I found down there, the size of it, the way it extends into the rock face, it's part of something much larger, something that would have to go down 20, maybe 30 meters more." "So what is it?" Boris asked. "I don't know, but it wasn't made by any geological process I understand." That night, the temperature dropped even further. The guards issued us extra blankets, but they were thin and full of holes, and the barracks weren't insulated well enough to keep the cold from creeping in through the gaps in the walls. We huddled together for warmth, taking turns keeping the single wood-burning stove fed with whatever scraps of fuel we could find. I was lying on my bunk, trying to find a position where the straw mattress didn't poke through my ribs, when I heard Alexei whisper my name. "Pavel, are you awake? Can't sleep in this cold. What is it? Listen." I held my breath and listened. At first I heard only the usual sounds of the barracks, coughing, men shifting in their sleep, the wind rattling the loose boards of the walls. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, a sound like singing, rising from somewhere underground. Not human voices, something else. The melody was strange, with intervals that didn't quite fit any musical scale I knew. It seemed to come from directly beneath us, as if something deep in the earth was humming to itself in the darkness. "You hear it too?" Alexei whispered. I nodded, though he probably couldn't see me in the dark. "How long has it been going on?" Started about an hour ago. I thought I was imagining it at first. We listened together, following the rise and fall of that impossible melody. It was almost hypnotic, the way it wove through the other sounds of the night. After a while, I realized I was unconsciously holding my breath, trying to hear it more clearly. "We should tell Dmitri," I said. But when we woke him, the singing had stopped. He listened for several minutes, shaking his head. "I don't hear anything unusual." "It was there," Alexei insisted. "Pavel heard it too." Dmitri looked at us with concern. "The cold can do things to a man's mind, make him hear things that aren't there. You should try to get some sleep." But sleep didn't come easily after that, and over the next few nights, others began to hear the singing too. The breakthrough came on the 17th day. We'd been working in shifts, pushing deeper into the increasingly warm earth. The shaft was now 18 meters deep, and the walls were showing more and more of that strange, dark stone. Whatever we were digging into, it was getting larger as we went down, as if the shaft was following the contours of some buried structure. I was part of the morning shift, working alongside Boris and Victor. The three of us had developed a rhythm over the previous weeks, taking turns with the picks while the others cleared away loose earth and stone. The smell was so thick down there now that we'd taken to working with rags tied over our faces, though it didn't help much. Victor was working the eastern wall of the shaft when his pick punched through into empty space. The sound was different this time. Not the ring of metal on stone, but a hollow thunk followed by silence. Victor staggered backward, nearly losing his balance. "There's something behind here," he called up to us, "a cavity of some kind." Boris and I moved to help him clear away more of the wall. The hole was small at first, just large enough to put your fist through. But as we worked to expand it, we realized we were breaking through into something much larger. Air began to flow through the opening. Not the cold air of the surface, but warm, humid air that carried that organic smell so strongly it made us gag. And with the air came sound. Not singing this time, but something like breathing, deep and slow and rhythmic, as if something very large was sleeping just beyond the wall. "Get Professor Volkov down here," Boris said quietly. "Right now." Dmitri descended into the shaft with a kerosene lamp, moving carefully on the wooden ladder we'd rigged along one wall. When he reached the bottom and saw what we'd uncovered, he went very still. "How large is the opening?" he asked. "Big enough for a man to crawl through," Victor answered. "Maybe bigger. We haven't cleared it all yet." Dmitri approached the hole cautiously, holding the lamp out in front of him. The warm air flowing through the opening made the flame dance and flicker. He peered through the gap for a long moment, then pulled back with a sharp intake of breath. "What's in there?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he played the lamplight around the edges of the hole, examining the stone. "This isn't natural," he said finally. "These walls were worked by tools, carved. This is some kind of chamber." "How big?" "I can't tell. The light doesn't reach far enough. But it's large. Very large." Above us, we could hear Lieutenant Markov shouting orders. Word had reached the surface that we'd broken through into something, and the guards were getting agitated. Within minutes, Markov himself was descending into the shaft, his face flushed with cold and irritation. "What have you found?" he demanded. Dmitri gestured to the opening. "Some kind of underground chamber, pre-existing, not a natural cave formation." Markov pushed past him and peered through the hole. Even from where I stood, I could see his expression change as the warm air hit his face and that thick, organic smell filled his nostrils. "How old?" he asked. "Impossible to say without proper examination. Could be very old, centuries, maybe more." Markov was quiet for a long moment, staring into the darkness beyond the opening. Then he turned to us with the kind of smile that meant someone was about to suffer. "Expand the hole," he ordered. "Make it big enough for a man to go through." "Sir," Dmitri said carefully, "perhaps we should proceed more cautiously. Send word to Moscow, get proper equipment, bring in specialists who—" "You are the specialist, Professor, and I'm giving you an order. Expand the opening. Someone is going down there to see what we found." It took us the rest of that day, and most of the next, to widen the hole enough for a man to squeeze through. We worked in shifts, breaking away chunks of that dark worked stone until the opening was roughly circular and perhaps a meter across. The warm air continued to flow out, and the breathing sounds continued, though they seemed to grow fainter as we worked. On the evening of the 18th day, Dmitri volunteered to be the first to descend into the chamber. I can still see him preparing for that descent. He'd fashioned a crude harness from rope, tested it multiple times to make sure it would hold his weight. He carried 2 kerosene lamps, one lit and one as backup, and a canvas bag with basic tools and measuring equipment. His movements were careful and methodical, the way a man moves when he knows he might not get a second chance to do something right. But I could see the fear in his eyes. We all could. "If something goes wrong," he told us quietly, "if you hear me shout or if the rope goes slack, pull me back up immediately. Don't wait to find out what happened." Lieutenant Markov stood at the edge of the shaft, watching everything with those cold eyes of his. "How deep do you think it goes?" he asked. "The rope is 30 meters long," Dmitri answered. "We'll find out if that's enough." He lowered himself through the opening feet first, playing out the rope slowly. We watched his lamplight disappear into the darkness below, leaving us standing around the hole in the ground like mourners at a graveside. For the first few minutes, we could hear him moving around down there. The scrape of his boots on stone, his voice muffled and distorted, calling out measurements and observations. Then the sound stopped. The silence stretched out. 5 minutes, 10, 15. "Professor," Markov called down through the opening, "report your status." No answer. Boris grabbed the rope and gave it an experimental tug. It was taut but not under strain, as if Dmitri was standing somewhere below but not moving. "Professor Volkov," Markov shouted, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber below. "Respond immediately or we're pulling you up." Still nothing. Then, just as Boris was preparing to haul on the rope, we heard Dmitri scream, not a shout of pain or surprise, but a scream of absolute terror. The sound echoed up through the opening with a strange, hollow quality that made it seem like it was coming from much farther away than 30 meters. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of running footsteps on stone. Then, Dmitri was shouting up at us, his voice cracking with panic. Pull me up now, don't let it." His words were cut off by a sound I'd never heard before, and hope never to hear again. Something between a roar and a sigh, impossibly deep and resonant. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising from the depths of the earth like the voice of some sleeping giant, awakened too early from dreams it didn't want to leave. We hauled on the rope with everything we had. Boris and Victor and I, pulling hand over hand while Lieutenant Markov stood back with his pistol drawn, as if a sidearm would be any use against whatever was down there in the dark. Dmitri came up through the opening like a cork from a bottle, gasping and wild-eyed, his lamp broken and his clothes torn. But it was his face that stopped us cold. His beard, which had been steel gray that morning, was now streaked with white, and his eyes held a look I'd seen before on men who'd been too long in solitary confinement, the look of someone who'd seen something that fundamentally changed their understanding of the world. He collapsed on the floor of the shaft, shaking uncontrollably. It took several minutes before he could speak coherently, and even then the words came out in fragments. "So large," he whispered. "The chamber, it goes down so far, and the walls carved, symbols, pictures, things that—" He shuddered and pressed his hands over his eyes. "God help us. We shouldn't have opened it. We should seal it back up right now, tonight, before—" "Before what?" Markov demanded. "What did you see down there?" Dmitri looked up at him, and I saw something in his face that might have been pity. "It's not dead," he said quietly. I thought, but it's not dead. It's sleeping." And we woke it up. That night, Commandant Kozlov arrived at the shaft site with a detachment of guards and orders sealed with red wax. He was a practical man who'd spent 20 years dealing with the problems of running labor camps in impossible conditions. But when he looked down into our excavation, when he smelled that thick organic air rising from the depths, something in his face changed. He questioned Dmitri privately for over an hour. We couldn't hear what was said, but we could see them through the window of the site office, the commandant leaning forward, asking questions. Dmitri shaking his head, gesturing with his hands, trying to explain something that clearly didn't want to be explained. When they emerged, Kozlov's jaw was set in the way it got before he ordered executions. "The work continues," he announced to our assembled detail. "But new procedures are now in effect. No one descends into the chamber without direct authorization. All observations are to be reported to Lieutenant Markov immediately. Anyone who discusses what they've seen with prisoners outside this detail will be shot." He paused, letting that sink in. "Moscow wants to know what we've found. We're going to tell them." Over the next 3 days, they sent 4 more men down into the chamber. Each descent was carefully planned, with longer ropes, better equipment, and detailed instructions about what to look for and document. The first man down was Senior Guard Volkov, a veteran of the Civil War who'd volunteered because he thought prison duty had made him soft. He was gone for 40 minutes and came back up silent. When Markov pressed him for a report, he would only say that the chamber was very large and very old, and that there were things carved into the walls that made him uncomfortable to look at. The second descent was made by a political prisoner named Grigory Sokolev, a former architect who'd been sentenced for designing churches the state considered too ornate. They chose him because his background meant he might understand structural details that escaped the rest of us. He descended with a surveyor's measuring tape and came back with figures that made no sense. Verdor. "The chamber extends at least 60 meters in each direction," he reported to Markov. "The ceiling is 30 meters high at the center. The walls are covered in carvings, but they're not like any architectural style I've studied. The proportions are wrong. The angles don't follow any geometric principles I understand." "What about the sounds?" Markov asked. "The breathing?" Sokolev was quiet for a long moment. "There's something at the far end of the chamber. Large. I couldn't see it clearly by lamplight, but I could hear it. Breathing, yes, but also movement, shifting, like something very big trying to get comfortable in a space that's too small for it." The third man down was Boris. They chose him because of his experience in steel production, thinking his practical knowledge might help identify any metallic objects or structures in the chamber. He volunteered eagerly, and I think part of him was genuinely curious about what lay beneath our feet. He was gone for 2 hours. When they finally hauled him back up, his hair had gone completely white. Not streaked like Dmitri's, but pure white from root to tip, as if decades had passed during his time in the darkness. He wouldn't speak for the rest of that day. Just sat in the corner of the barracks, staring at nothing, occasionally making small sounds under his breath that might have been words in a language none of us recognized. The fourth descent was supposed to be Alexei, but he refused. Flat out refused. Consequences be damned. "Shoot me if you want," he told Markov. "I've seen what happens to men who go down there. I won't do it." Markov probably would have shot him, but by then the guards were getting nervous too. 3 descents, 3 men who came back fundamentally changed. Even the guards could see that something was wrong with the whole operation. That's when young Mikhail volunteered. I tried to stop him. We all did. He was barely 18, still had some optimism left despite months in the camps. But he was also desperate to prove himself, to show the guards and the other prisoners that he was more than just a scared boy from Moscow University. "I'll be careful," he promised us. "I'll go down, take some measurements, and come right back up, an hour at most." He was down there for 6 hours. We knew something had gone wrong after the first 90 minutes. The rope had gone slack, not taut the way it should be if someone was moving around at the end of it. Markov shouted down through the opening repeatedly, but there was no response. They were preparing to send a rescue party when we heard Mikhail's voice echoing up from the depths. But it wasn't calling for help. It was singing. The same melody Alexei and I had heard that first night, rising from underground. But now it had words, though they weren't in any language we recognized. The voice was definitely Mikhail's, but there was something wrong with the cadence, the rhythm. It was as if he'd learned the song from something that didn't quite understand how human voices were supposed to work. The singing continued for hours. Sometimes it would fade, as if Mikhail was moving deeper into the chamber. Sometimes it would grow louder, echoing up through the opening with that strange, hollow quality. But it never stopped entirely. When they finally hauled him up, he was smiling. Not the desperate smile of a man rescued from danger, but peaceful, serene. The way a man might smile after receiving news that solved all his problems at once. His clothes were filthy, torn in places, and there were scrapes on his hands and face that suggested he'd been crawling through tight spaces. But his eyes were calm, almost dreamy, and he hummed quietly to himself as they helped him out of the shaft. "Report," Markov demanded. Mikhail looked at him with that peaceful smile. It's beautiful down there, Lieutenant. So much older than we are. So much wiser. The carvings tell stories that go back to the beginning of everything, and the Guardian has been waiting so long for someone to understand. Guardian? It's been sleeping, but not really sleeping. Dreaming. Dreaming of the time when the Earth was young and the old agreements still held. But people forgot. People stopped listening. So it had to wait, had to dream, had to hope that someday someone would dig deep enough to find it again. Markov grabbed Mikhail by the shoulders and shook him. What did you see down there? Describe it. Mikhail's smile never wavered. You wouldn't understand if I told you. Your mind isn't ready. None of your minds are ready, but they could be. The Guardian could teach you, could teach all of us. We just have to be willing to learn. That night, Mikhail disappeared from the barracks. We woke to find his bunk empty, his blankets cold. The guards searched the camp, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The perimeter fence was intact, the guard towers reported no movement, and the snow around the building showed no footprints. But if you stood near the shaft site, you could hear singing coming from underground. The same melody, the same inhuman rhythm, but fainter now, deeper. Moscow's response came 3 days later in the form of a sealed train carrying 24 specialists and enough equipment to seal a mine. Geologists, engineers, demolitions experts, and a political officer whose job was to ensure that what happened at Facility 7 stayed at Facility 7. They worked with military efficiency. First, they lowered recording equipment into the chamber, instruments that could capture sound and take photographs in low light. The photographs, when they were developed, showed carved walls covered in symbols that resembled no known writing system. The audio recordings captured sounds that made the technicians pale and request transfers back to Moscow. Then, they began preparing the charges. The demolitions work took 2 days. They packed enough explosive into the shaft to bring down a city block, shaped charges designed to collapse not just the opening, but the entire chamber system below. The political officer supervised everything personally, checking each connection, each timer, each failsafe. On the final night, as they prepared for the controlled detonation, something went wrong with the plan. The singing started again around midnight. Not just Mikhail's voice this time, but others. Men's voices, harmonizing in that impossible melody, echoing up from the depths with a resonance that seemed to shake the ground itself. But these weren't voices from the chamber. The voices were coming from different directions, from the forest around the camp, from the guard towers, from inside the barracks themselves. I woke to find 3 men from our work detail sitting up in their bunks, singing along with the underground chorus. Their eyes were closed, their faces peaceful, and they were harmonizing perfectly with music they'd never heard before. Alexei was one of them. I shook him, slapped him, shouted his name, but he just kept singing, his voice blending seamlessly with the others. When I grabbed his face and forced him to look at me, his eyes opened, but they were distant, unfocused, as if he was looking at something very far away. The guards were shouting outside, orders being barked, boots running on frozen ground, the distinctive sound of rifle bolts being worked. But underneath it all, more voices were joining the chorus. Guards singing, prisoners singing. Even some of the specialists from Moscow were standing in the snow outside their quarters, their faces turned toward the shaft, their voices adding to the growing harmony. The political officer tried to set off the charges early, but his demolitions team was singing too, standing around their equipment with vacant smiles, humming along with the chorus rising from the earth. That's when I understood what Dmitri had meant about waking something up. The thing in the chamber wasn't just sleeping, it was dreaming. And its dreams were seeping up through the ground, spreading through the camp, touching the minds of everyone who heard its song. The chamber we'd broken into wasn't a tomb or a dwelling. It was an incubation chamber, a place where something ancient had been waiting for the right conditions to emerge. I grabbed Victor and Boris, the only 2 men in our barracks who weren't singing, and we ran for the shaft site. If we could somehow trigger the explosives manually, maybe we could still collapse the chamber before whatever was down there completed whatever it was trying to do. But we were too late. The ground around the shaft was bulging upward, dirt and stone pushed aside by something rising from below. The wooden framework around the opening splintered and collapsed as the earth itself restructured around whatever was emerging. And The singing was getting louder. Not just voices now, but something else. A sound like wind through vast spaces, like the breathing of something impossibly large, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The harmony was so complex, so layered with overtones and frequencies that shouldn't exist, that listening to it made your skull ache and your vision blur. That's when I saw it. Not the thing itself, not directly, but its shadow cast by our work lights against the swirling snow and steam rising from the disrupted ground. A shadow that was too big, too wrong, moving in ways that made my mind refuse to process what my eyes were showing it. And still, more voices joined the chorus. The commandant stood in the doorway of his quarters, singing. Lieutenant Markov had his arms raised toward the sky, his voice carrying over the others with perfect pitch. Even the sentry dogs were howling in harmony, their voices blending with the human singers and the impossible sound rising from the earth. I understood then that we had maybe minutes before whatever was happening became irreversible, before the thing in the chamber finished its emergence and claimed every mind in the camp. I grabbed Victor's arm and pointed toward the equipment shed where the Moscow team had stored their backup explosives. "The dynamite!" I shouted over the singing. "If we can get to the dynamite!" But Victor was staring at the shaft site with a strange expression on his face. Not fear, but something closer to wonder. "Listen," he said quietly. "Really listen. It's not malevolent, Pavel. It's just been alone for so long." I saw the peaceful smile starting to spread across his face, and I knew I was running out of time. Boris was still himself, still resistant to whatever influence was spreading through the camp. Together, we fought our way through the snow toward the equipment shed, past guards who stood motionless in the cold, their faces turned toward the sky, their voices adding to the growing symphony. The shed was locked, but Boris had spent years working with steel. He knew how to break things when breaking them was necessary. We smashed our way inside and found cases of dynamite, coils of fuse, and boxes of blasting caps. Neither of us was an explosives expert, but we understood the basics. Attach the caps, light the fuses, and run like hell. We worked with shaking hands while the singing grew louder outside, while the ground continued to heave and buckle around the shaft site. We rigged 6 charges with the longest fuses we could find, then carried them through the chaos toward the disturbed ground around the excavation. Men stood everywhere in the swirling snow, all of them singing, all of them smiling that same peaceful smile. Some had their arms raised toward whatever was emerging from the earth. Others were walking slowly toward the shaft site, as if drawn by something we couldn't see. The shadow was larger now, more distinct. I caught glimpses of it through the steam and snow, something that might have been vaguely humanoid, but was wrong in every proportion, every angle. Too tall, too broad, with appendages that moved in ways that violated everything I understood about anatomy and physics. We placed our charges in a rough circle around the disturbed area and lit the fuses with matches from the guard shack. The flames caught and began their slow burn toward the dynamite, maybe 30 seconds before detonation, enough time to get clear if we ran immediately. But as we turned to flee, I saw Boris stop. He was looking toward the shaft site with that same wondering expression I'd seen on Victor's face. His mouth opened and a sound came out, wordless at first, but gradually forming into the same melody everyone else was singing. I grabbed his arm, tried to pull him away from the area, but he shook me off gently. His face was calm, peaceful, as if he'd just solved a puzzle that had been troubling him for years. "Don't you understand, Pavel?" he said quietly. "It's calling us home. We've been wandering for so long, and finally, something wants us to come home." I ran alone through the snow, stumbling over frozen ground, while behind me, the fuses burned down toward the charges we'd planted. The singing was so loud now it seemed to be coming from the air itself, from the snow, from my own bones. The explosions came as a series of sharp cracks, followed by a rumble that shook the ground for kilometers. Snow cascaded from the trees, and the wooden buildings of the camp swayed on their foundations. But underneath the sound of the detonations, I could still hear the singing. When the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, the shaft was gone, buried under tons of collapsed stone and earth, sealed as thoroughly as human engineering could manage. The rising thing, whatever it had been, was trapped beneath the rubble. But the singing continued for 3 more hours. Men stood in the ruins of the camp, their voices raised in that impossible harmony, even as rescue teams arrived from the nearest military outpost, even as medics tried to treat them for exposure and shock. They sang until dawn, when the melody finally faded and they collapsed in the snow like puppets whose strings had been cut. Most of them died that night. Exposure, the official report said. Hypothermia brought on by standing motionless in sub-zero temperatures for hours. Of the 37 men in our work detail, only 6 survived the night. Of those, 3 died in the military hospital over the following weeks, their bodies simply giving up for no reason the doctors could identify. That left 3 of us to tell the story to debriefing officers who took careful notes and sealed them in files that would never be opened. Viktor Semenov, who spent the rest of his sentence in the psychiatric ward at Facility 12, drawing pictures of symbols he claimed to remember from the chamber walls. Boris Karpinsky, who survived his camp sentence but hanged himself in a Leningrad apartment 6 months after his release. And me. The official records show that a mining accident at Facility 7 resulted in 31 deaths and the abandonment of the site. The surviving prisoners were transferred to other camps. The guards and staff were reassigned. The Moscow specialists returned to their institutions with orders never to discuss their work in the Urals. I completed my sentence in 1942 and returned to a world at war. I worked in factories, married a woman who never asked about my time in the camps, raised 2 children who knew their father had secrets but were wise enough not to pry. I lived a quiet life, kept my head down, and tried to forget what I'd seen beneath the Ural Mountains. But you never really forget something like that. For 63 years, I've carried the memory of that singing. The way it seemed to bypass your ears and speak directly to something deeper, something that remembered what it was like before we built cities and wrote laws and convinced ourselves we were the only intelligent things on this planet. I still dream about it sometimes, about standing in that chamber with a flickering lamp, looking up at walls covered in carvings that hurt to examine too closely, about the breathing sounds in the darkness, deep and patient and utterly alien. About the moment when I understood that we hadn't discovered something buried and forgotten. We'd found something that was waiting. The site is still sealed as far as I know. After the war, they built a hydroelectric plant in the valley, flooded the whole area behind a concrete dam. The camp, the shaft, the chamber, everything lies now beneath 40 meters of dark water. But sometimes, in the deepest part of winter when the wind comes down from the mountains, I think I can still hear it. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. That impossible harmony, rising from somewhere far below, patient and eternal, waiting for someone else to dig deep enough to let it out. My name is Pavel Antonovich Krupin. I'm 82 years old, and I'm dying of lung cancer brought on by too many years of breathing concrete dust in Soviet factories. When I'm gone, this story dies with me. Make of it what you will.